One of the trickiest parts of getting set up with the Entity Framework is getting connected to a database. We're going to need to connect to some database to use the Entity Framework and to create migrations. So let me give you a few tips here. Since I'm using Visual Studio, I'm going to be using Microsoft's LocalDB. This is a version of Microsoft SQL Server that is installed when you install Visual Studio, and unless you heavily customized your installation, you should have a LocalDB installed. You might also want to go to your Visual Studio installation and make sure you install some of the data tools, because these graphical tools can make working with the database a little bit easier. Now, if you're not using Visual Studio and you're not using Windows, don't worry, there are other databases that the Entity Framework can work with. If you do a search for Entity Framework Core database providers, chances are you will end up on this page on docs.microsoft.com, which maintains a list of the current database providers supported by the Entity Framework. So in addition to SQL Server, there's also many popular databases like SQLite and MySQL. The good news is, once you've established a database and you've worked through how to connect and how to add a connection string to the Entity Framework, all the application code that we're going to look at is going to be the same as what I write. I also want to point out that if you're not on Windows, another option is still to run Microsoft SQL Server, and to do that by using Docker images that Microsoft provides. So there's Docker images that will allow you to run SQL Server on Linux or with Docker for Mac or Windows. Again, you can do a search for this particular quick start. You should be able to find all the information you need to get SQL Server running in a container. And again, for those of you not using Visual Studio, there are some great tools out there that will allow you to work with Microsoft SQL Server. One example is the command line tool MS SQL CLI. Just like the .NET CLI, this is a cross-platform tool. So this works on Windows as well as Mac OS and Linux. It allows you to connect to a database and issue queries. It has IntelliSense. It's really an overall great tool. There's also extensions that you can plug into Visual Studio Code that will allow you to query SQL Server. Again, what I'm going to do is use Microsoft's LocalDB. So if I come back into Visual Studio, what I want to do is go to View, SQL Server Object Explorer, just to show you that I should be able to see LocalDB inside of this Object Explorer. So this is an instance of SQL Server that is running. I already have several databases inside of my LocalDB instance, and the specific instance that we want to use is localDB/MS SQL LocalDB. So when we create our connection string to tell the Entity Framework, here's the SQL server that you're going to point to, we need to use this name for the name of the server. So localDB inside of parentheses, and then the / MS SQL LocalDB. Once we have a connection string configured, we can have that connection string passed into our DB context so it knows what database to go to. And once our DB context is hooked up to a database, we can also start to add migrations and manage our database through this project. So let's start working through those goals next.